NATO boosting its forces on its eastern flank in Europe. In the month since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the alliance has already doubled its troops levels in eastern Ukraine. In Eastern Europe, rather. About 40,000 troops are now under its direct command. That force includes battle groups of up to 1,500 soldiers in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Now, NATO wants to station units in 4 additional countries like Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said the measures were part of a reset in response to a new reality.
Today, NATO leaders agreed to reset our deterrence and defence for the longer term, to face a new security reality. We will have substantially more forces in the eastern part of the alliance at higher readiness. 1 month since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO's security environment has fundamentally changed for the long haul. And we are responding with more troops, with more air assets and more maritime capabilities. It's a new reality, it's a new normal, and NATO is responding for the long term.
U.S. President Joe Biden is in Brussels to meet with European allies in person. He pledged to support those fleeing the fighting in Ukraine and announced new sanctions on individuals linked to the Russian regime. He also said Vladimir Putin has underestimated the resolve and unity of NATO.
Today marks 1 month since Russia began its carnage in Ukraine, the brutal invasion of Ukraine. Putin was banking on NATO being split. My early conversation with him in December and early January, it was clear to me he didn't think we could sustain this cohesion. NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite what he intended to have as a consequence of going into Ukraine. We have to stay fully, totally, thoroughly united. Thank you.
Our first guest is Alexander Stubb, a former Prime Minister of Finland. Currently, he's a professor at the European University Institute. Welcome to the day. Now, your country is in the European Union, but not in NATO. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for the first time, most Finns say they want to join the alliance. Is your country preparing to apply for membership?
Yeah, I guess the right way to put it is to say we are not in NATO yet. Yes, I predict that Finland will file an application for NATO membership, not in days, not in weeks, but within a few months. We basically had a reversal of opinion polls. Used to be 50% against, 20 in favor. Now it's 62% in favor and 16 against. So we have a parliamentary procedure and we are going to join NATO at the end of the day.
And joining NATO is because you and your country fear that Putin's goals of empire extend beyond Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a minority in advocating Finnish membership ever since 1995. But now I think our population is rightly so being driven by what I call rational fear. So the thought is that, listen, if Putin can slaughter his brothers, sisters, and cousins in Ukraine, why wouldn't he do the same thing with Finland? And I think the sentiment that we have is that we never want to be alone again, like we were in the Winter War against the Soviet Union. So therefore, the population is in favor of NATO membership.
Let's talk a little bit about sanctions. We've seen sanctions in finance, in transport, in the world of sports, even energy too. But there are continuous calls from inside Ukraine, particularly from President Zelensky, for an oil and gas embargo. How vital would this step be?
I think it would be vital. And obviously, we've seen 3, now 4, and coming up to 5 waves of sanctions. The way in which I see it is that Russia will be utterly isolated by the end of this. That means political, economic, financial, sport, culture, and energy isolation. So I foresee first an oil embargo and then basically step-by-step movement away from Russian gas. I think that's the only right thing to do.
Do you think an oil embargo would push Vladimir Putin to bend because that would hamper his economy severely, or is he fully on a legacy-defining mission in Ukraine right now?
I think it's very much about his legacy, his place in history. You know, he wants to see himself next to Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, or Stalin, and he'll be doing everything in his power to achieve that. And I do think that, going for oil embargoes and gas embargoes, they will probably hasten the process of isolating him. But will that change his mind? I'm not 100% sure it will, but I still think that we need to be on the right side of history here.
You believe in instilling some kind of embargo, but here in Germany, the government is unwilling to block Russian energy given its dependence on Moscow. Berlin says this war marked a turning point, but it can't turn fast enough for Ukraine. What do you hope Germany does in this conflict with regard to this oil embargo?
Step by step, I think. I come from a country with 1,340 kilometers of border, and the way in which we set up our energy portfolio was to make sure that we would not be dependent on Russia. That's why we have nuclear. That's why we never did anything like the Energiewende. So I would say that go for the oil embargo first, and then, because you can get oil from different kinds of places in the world. Yeah, we're going to have to pay a higher price, and then sort of start weaning yourself off of the gas. In Finland, actually, gas is only for the industry, so we don't do any housing on that. So it's, I guess, a bit easier for a Finn to say than for a German. And I must also say that as a professor, it's easy to analyze this stuff from the audience. It's a bit more difficult when you're in the middle of it and taking those decisions.
Now, there are negotiations ongoing between Russia and Ukraine right now. We continue to hear talk, though, of so-called Finlandization of Ukraine, that under duress, the smaller neighbor is essentially forced to accept Moscow's influence and pledge neutrality. What do you say to people who suggest this as a way out of this war?
Well, I love Germany, but there's one phrase from Germany that I don't love, and that's Finlandization. I think it was coined by a German professor in 1966. My answer is absolutely no solution to anything. And you have to understand that for us Finns, Finlandization is actually a little bit of an insult. It's a sore point in our history. We had to compromise our liberties. We had to compromise our democracy. We had to compromise our security. So it is absolutely no solution for Ukraine. Basta.
Your country certainly knows about the difficulties of making such a step, and we've heard President Zelensky say that he, too, is not willing to compromise. Now, diplomacy, let's talk about that. Is there space here to maneuver when Putin's demands are simply unacceptable to Ukraine?
Well, to be honest, my experience comes from the war in Georgia in 2008, and I was Finland's foreign minister at the time and also chairman of the OSCE. So I flew into Tbilisi with French Foreign Minister Bernard Kouchner, and we mustered a ceasefire agreement in 5 days. It had 6 points. But to be honest, the stakes were much lower at the time. It was easier for President Medvedev at the time and Prime Minister Putin to accept that. I don't think there's room of maneuver for a ceasefire agreement at the moment. So it's the moment when idealism, in other words, peace, hits reality, in other words, war. I just don't see where they could actually get closer. And as I said, Putin will destroy Ukraine. That's his aim. And Zelensky will fight back. And at the end of the day, we'll see who is the last man standing.
Alexander Stubb, a former Prime Minister of Finland, thank you very much for your time and your insights.
My pleasure.
After a month of war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has bogged down, reportedly. With the ground offensive stalled in several places, the Russian military has been increasingly targeting civilian infrastructure. And yet, despite the huge number of Ukrainians suffering, the country's military has so far been able to keep Russian forces at bay against all odds.
Flames and smoke billowing from a Russian transport ship in the harbor of Russian-occupied Berdyansk. Lines for humanitarian aid stretching in front of bombed-out apartment blocks in the heavily struck city of Mariupol. A month into Russia's war in Ukraine, every day is full of images that only weeks ago were difficult, if not impossible, to imagine in modern Europe. The sun was shining in Kyiv, and no bombs were falling for the moment as soldiers and civilians reflected on a month of war.
Ukrainians have united as never before, perhaps. This makes me very happy. And the Russians made a big mistake coming after our country, our land. We will bite their throats. It's our homeland. Morale is as high as on the first day, and it will remain so until the last day, Victory Day. We remain determined.
Ukraine has proven its resilience, but sustained bombardment, bodies in the streets, and life in bomb shelters with limited or no power or heat are bound to take their toll on even the bravest.
I feel hopelessness. One doesn't know what to do next, how to behave. I try to keep calm and only hope that everything will be over and all will be fine as it was before, and to see the smiles return to people's faces and our chances to enjoy life return to us.
A month ago, no one knew how long Ukraine could hold out against Russia. And yet, despite the toll to human life and infrastructure, and the sheer size of the Russian war machine, the underdog is still standing.
Our correspondent Matthias Berlinger is in Kyiv and sent us this assessment.
We have just returned to Kyiv. We've been away for a week in the western part of the country, and the mood has changed slightly here. We see more shops open. For example, hairdressers are open now. They used to be closed. Most of the shops are still closed, but a few more businesses are operating. You see more people on the street. You see more traffic. So it feels like the city is making its way back to normalcy in very small steps. It is, of course, still a city in an extraordinary situation. You can still hear shelling and in daytime and at night from the outskirts. The Ukrainians have driven the Russians a bit further away from the city. That's at least what we hear. But the fighting is close enough that you can hear it even if you are in the city center. However, there seems to be like the trend seems to have shifted a little bit. That's the feeling here on the ground. The Russian troops have tried to capture Kyiv. Everybody understands or estimates that that was their top priority, to capture Kyiv, quickly decapitate the government, and it has not worked. Moreover, while Russian troops have advanced to these places around Kyiv where they are now quite quickly, they have almost been unable to make any gains within 3 weeks or so, and we've also seen some signs that they are digging trenches now, that this is moving towards a war of attrition rather than an invasion or an advance, and that's obviously something that gives people here the hope that the Russians that Ukraine might be able to drive the Russians out in the end, or to create a situation, Terry has said this before, where the Russians would understand that they cannot achieve their goal, and then in negotiations they could be convinced to leave the country. That's the hope now. It's still not where we are. It's nothing that people expect to happen in the next few weeks or so, but it's something that could be a possible outcome in the longer term. There's very careful, but some optimism is here.
Joining us now is Eliot Cohen, a defense and security expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to the program. As of right now, the Western intelligence assessment is Russia's advance has stalled. But in recent days, you've said that's not all, that Ukraine is actually winning this war. Why do you see it that way?
So first, let me stipulate that the Ukrainian population is paying a terrible price, and one doesn't want to minimize their suffering. Also, I'm saying that they're winning, not that they've won or even necessarily that they will win, although actually I think in the long run, there's a very good chance of that. It's not just that the Russians have stalled, although that we should pause a moment and think about that. The Russians had every advantage going into this war. They surrounded Ukraine on three sides. They were able to amass their forces exactly as they wanted. They were able to launch the attacks just when they wanted. We know that they thought they could overrun that country in a few days. And if you look at the map, they haven't actually gotten into the heart of the country. They've been stopped in most of their offensives. And indeed, in a number of areas, particularly around Kyiv, the Ukrainians have actually gone on the counteroffensive. But it really goes much beyond that. Let's start with casualties. The current estimates are that the Russians have probably lost between 10 and 15,000 soldiers killed. To put that in perspective, the Russians took about 15,000 killed during the course of the entire Afghan war. In addition to that, standard rule of thumb in estimating casualties, and this is on the low side, for every individual killed, you have several more who are wounded, taken prisoner, or disappear. So in other words, what that means is of a total invasion force of something on the order of 200,000, maybe less, there are probably about 30,000 troops that have been taken off the battlefield. Those are very, very heavy casualties. Beyond that, we see it's not just private soldiers getting killed. They've lost 6 generals. That's a testimony to a number of things: poor signal communications, discipline using open cell phones, which can be tracked and monitored, but also the fact that senior officers, generals and colonels, have to go on to the front lines to make things happen. That means that your junior officers can't make things happen on their own. We've seen tremendous logistical failures. That notorious 40-mile convoy, which wasn't really a convoy, it was more like a traffic jam northwest of Kyiv. That's a result of logistical incompetence. And there are plenty of other manifestations of that as well. So I'll give you just one last statistic. It's quite extraordinary. The Ukrainians have captured more Russian tanks and other kinds of vehicles than they have lost. And they've captured more Russian hardware that has been destroyed. What that indicates to me is that you have, on the other side, a military that's just not very competent. And that's borne out if you look at such videos of combat as we see, the Russians just aren't very good.
Talk to us a little bit further about Ukraine now. The armed forces today look vastly different than they did before 2014, before Russia annexed Crimea. There's been support from the U.S., the U.K. and Canada in terms of training, extensive training. How does the military look today in that fact is able to hold off the Russian attack right now?
Well, it's a very different military. And, even in 2014, 2015, they were already getting a lot better. And they were, in fact, able to deny the Russians their maximal objectives in Donbass. I think probably the most important thing they've gotten out of training is the Western way of war, which involves a lot of initiative for junior officers. It means having capable sergeants, non-commissioned officers, which the Russians don't really have. I think it's also fair to say that the Ukrainians are actually pretty well equipped, but most important of all, they are utterly motivated. They are fighting for their lives, they're fighting for their freedom, they're fighting for their families, they're fighting on their own turf, whereas the Russian soldiers don't know what they're fighting for. In fact, many of them didn't even know that they're going off to a war. So between that and the kind of weapons supply that the Ukrainians are getting, they've really, in many ways, done an extraordinary job of setting back the Russians and, in many cases, defeating them.
Eliot Cohen, defense and security expert at CSIS. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
If Vladimir Putin believed his invasion of Ukraine would result in a quick victory, he severely miscalculated Ukrainians. Western intelligence believes 1,000 of his soldiers are either being killed or injured every day, and Russian forces are facing difficulties meeting their initial military goals. As his forces struggle to regain their momentum, they continue to attack areas with civilians. A warning, this next report contains distressing images.
An apartment block under fire. This is Mariupol, the Ukrainian city Russia has been targeting since the start of its invasion. Targets include its citizens, who've paid a heavy price. This distraught mother holds her sleeping child. Her other child was killed in Russian shelling. For those still here, there's little left.
We have nothing to eat. It's awful. It's just awful. No light, no heat, nothing.
Russian forces have attacked schools.
Yeah, he freed us from education.
And community buildings. When this theatre was bombed, it was acting as a shelter for hundreds of people. It's still unclear how many died. Hospitals too have been targeted. This pregnant woman who was filmed being rescued from Mariupol's maternity hospital later died, half an hour after her baby was delivered stillborn. Since the war began a month ago, there have been more than 60 attacks on Ukrainian medical facilities, including hospitals, according to the World Health Organization. Over the last few weeks, Russian air power and artillery have struck at residential areas in other cities, like Kharkiv.
How could this monster, oh my God, monster come up with something like this, to destroy everything? People are starving, there is no water, no wood for heating, and he decided to destroy a city. In the 21st century, a beautiful city.
1 month on, it seems no one, not even children, are safe in Putin's war.
Our next guest is Keir Giles, who's a Russia expert at the foreign policy think tank Chatham House. Thank you for joining us here. We're seeing the bombs now falling on civilian targets. That's been going on throughout this 4-week war so far. There is concern Putin will resort to tactics similar to what he employed in Chechnya. How can that war help us predict what he might do here in Ukraine, as he's not necessarily making the gains on the battleground that he had hoped for?
Well, concern that he may resort to doing this is a strange way to put it, because that is exactly what has been happening since day 5 of this war. It wasn't right from the beginning, because let's not forget, in the very early stages, Russia thought it could win quickly and easily without even a fight, because they assumed, believing their own propaganda, that Ukraine was a pushover and it would be a liberation of the Ukrainian people from this imaginary fascist band that was governing them. But instead, as soon as Russia realized it was not going to be able to win cleverly and not going to be able to win through military means, they almost immediately pivoted to this default tactic of causing the maximum civilian suffering possible, of engineering these humanitarian disasters, because that, for Russia, is an effective way of winning wars. They've seen how effective it is not only in Chechnya, also in Syria. Because not only does it put pressure on President Zelensky to make concessions, to surrender in order to end the suffering, it also means that other countries around the world will also be piling on that pressure, trying to get Zelensky to end the war in order to preserve life so that life can go on.
When we talk about a potential off-ramp for Putin, this is a big discussion here in Europe. What can European allies do to push him to, exit Ukraine? Is there anything that you see happening here that would push Vladimir Putin to turn his troops around, or is he going to continue this way?
Well, the key question is what exactly Vladimir Putin thinks is happening. And again, if he believed his own propaganda before moving the troops in, does he now have reliable sources of information on what the real situation on the ground is? He must be aware that the war has not been won in 48 hours. But in terms of the strength of Ukrainian resistance and the appalling casualties that the Russian troops themselves appear to be taking while not making forward progress, it's whether that information is actually getting through to President Putin so he has a real appreciation of the situation on the ground that will determine what he thinks his achievable war aims are. Now, some of those aims, of course, have already fallen away. You no longer hear talk about the imaginary denazification of Ukraine, the country with a Jewish president. But other ones, looking for territorial control, looking for the demilitarization of Ukraine, are probably still perfectly reasonable Russian aims, and something that President Putin could claim he has achieved, even if Russia pulls out its troops now. So there are two different aspects here. There's the reality on the ground, and there's what President Putin can actually sell to his domestic population as a success in this war.
Now, President Zelensky has repeatedly said that this war will not end with Ukraine. Do you think Putin's aspirations lie beyond Ukraine, that though, Ukraine is the crown jewel of the Russian Empire, in his mind, there's more territory that he rightfully sees as belonging to Russia?
Well, that's exactly right. This is not the war. It is a war. It is the first war in Russia's program of reconquest, and President Putin has laid out very clearly what he wants to reconquer. He's talking about the decisions of 100 years ago when the Russian Empire was dissolved as being catastrophic mistakes. And other Russian decision makers as well have come out with this idea that it is the Russian Empire that needs to be restored. And that, of course, includes not just Ukraine, not just Belarus, but also full-fledged members of the EU and NATO and the Western community of nations. That's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland. So yes, this is just the first phase in Russia's wars of reconquest.
Is there anyone in Putin's inner circle that's providing him with the information of perhaps what's actually happening on the ground? We clearly understand that this was not the case before this invasion, but do you think that anyone within his inner circle, again, could sort of change his mind, or is he the one making all the decisions and he doesn't want to hear it?
We have no way of knowing that. And anybody that says confidently that they do know exactly who is whispering in Putin's ear is either making it up or is disclosing classified information that they never should. We simply cannot tell. It's a black box what exactly is feeding into Putin's decision-making. All that we know is that it is producing the wrong results.
Talk to us a little bit about the support within Russia for this war. We know about the propaganda. We know that some independent stations, television stations, have shut down, that newspapers are not able to even call this a war. What kind of support is there inside Russia for this war?
That, too, is hard to tell because Russia has taken steps not only to isolate its own population from news and information from the outside world, but also made it very hard to figure out exactly what Russian people think. After all, surveys of opinion conducted from outside the country are now illegal, precisely so that we cannot tell that kind of information. Now, anybody that's been inculcated with a decade plus of Russian war propaganda through state television, you could forgive them for actually believing everything that they're being told about this being a crusade to liberate Ukrainians from neo-Nazis. But the young people who are accessing information from outside the country may have a different view, but even so, it may not make any difference. Russia has also prepared itself for crushing popular dissent. The repression has been getting tighter, not just since the war began, but over a period of several years, and Russia is fully prepared with its Rosgvardia, its National Guard internal security forces, to inflict mass casualties on protests on the streets in Russia itself.
Keir Giles, a senior consulting fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The World Health Organization says about 500,000 refugees who fled Ukraine will need treatment for mental health disorders. The WHO is stressing the need for immediate support as the refugee crisis grows, with many struggling as their families are torn apart.
The countries bordering Ukraine have become a haven for millions of people fleeing the war. They arrive in Poland and Moldova, desperate for safety. Natalia escaped the shelling in Mykolaiv, but left her husband behind.
We fled when they started bombing. That's why we decided to leave our home. 500 meters away from us, there was a rocket explosion. It was very scary. That's why we decided to leave.
Many families have been separated by the fighting.
I took a risk and fled with my daughter, but our relatives are too scared. My older daughter with her child was too scared. How could she manage? He's only 4 years old. But it's also scary here. We don't know where to go now.
The conflict has created the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War. Authorities are doing what they can to help new arrivals. Most of the children here are without their fathers, who are required to stay in Ukraine to fight. The World Health Organization says arrivals are not only suffering from a range of physical health problems, but also psychological distress.
The need for psychosocial support, because people have been suffering a lot. Children are displaced from their family. So this is a tremendous mental health stress, number one. Number two, or what we call non-communicable diseases or chronic diseases, people with high blood pressure, with cardiovascular disease, with diabetes, whose treatment has been interrupted. And the third one are the communicable diseases. First and foremost, COVID-19.
Several EU states are taking Ukrainians in. But while these refugees have reached physical safety, many will need a lot of support to help heal the mental scars left by what they've experienced.
Let's bring in DW correspondent Max Zander, who is standing by at the Polish-Ukrainian border. Max, we know that Poland has already taken in more than 2 million Ukrainian refugees so far. How is the situation unfolding where you are 1 month into this war?
Right, so the situation here on the ground in Poland, in the border region, is evolving. Pretty much everything that's happening on the other side of the border in Ukraine, sooner or later, will have an effect on what's going on here right now. But at the moment, it seems at various points here in the region, be it the train station in Przemyśl, which is the first point of entry for many Ukrainian refugees fleeing by train, or the border crossings, or places like this one right here in Przemyśl in the city. It seems the situation has become a lot calmer over the last couple days. Maybe just we can give you a little impression of what the situation here is right now. This is a former warehouse, a vacant warehouse, which now serves as a registration for passengers, for people who come to Ukraine, have come from Ukraine to Poland and need to continue on. There are NGOs on the ground as well, helping out, serving some food, and you can also get some medical attention here. Donations are being handed out, collected by volunteers and NGOs and by the municipality. A lot of groups there pitching in. But it seems that, as you can see, that there's not a lot of traffic here right now. This is due to the numbers having gone down of new arrivals by a threefold. So at the moment, this is a much-needed rest for some of the volunteers we spoke to, for some of the infrastructure here on the ground. But everybody knows that the situation sooner or later could change. If the Russian military makes significant gains in Ukraine, this could mean that a lot more people could come, and the situation could look very different very soon.
Max, the Polish prime minister has said the European Union needs to crush Russia with sanctions. Poland has also floated the idea of a NATO peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Is there a sense that Poland is not fully satisfied with how its allies are responding to this war?
Right. I mean, we heard some very strong words from the Polish government, in particular from the Polish Prime Minister, Morawiecki. Let's not forget that Poland is a frontline country, so to say. There's a war raging on their doorstep. Everything that happens in Ukraine in terms of the war is going to be felt here. The people fleeing from Ukraine, first and foremost, come to Poland. Aid that's being sent, a lot of it goes through Poland. So Poland has very much to do with what is going on there. But we also have a sense that there's also some fear that Poland could face further consequences in one way or another. So there's, Polish leadership is very much outspoken and asking for, very strong measures against Russia. You said rightly so. Prime Minister Morawiecki has asked for a NATO peacekeeping mission. This has been rejected. He's also been asking for stronger and more sanctions. For example, the banning of trade on sea and land routes with Russia entirely. Now, how much of this is realistic is not clear, but the bottom line is that the Polish government definitely is concerned.
DW correspondent Max Zander at the Polish-Ukrainian border. Thanks for this, Max.